Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on load growth and how is it shaping power markets. My name is Megha Hamal. I am the Chief Strategy and Communications Officer for the Illinois Power Agency. I will be your host today. And I want to also do a quick special shout out to IPA Communications Associate Tori Tartaglia, who will be managing the logistics on the back end. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. All participants are muted upon entry to avoid any background noise. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar utilizing the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom panel. And please note that today's session is being recorded, and a recorded version of this webinar will be available on the IPA website under Events. Next slide, Tori. Just a couple of points I would like to emphasize. As you all know, this Power Hour webinar series is intended for educational purposes only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or its staff. This 60-minute webinar will provide an overview on load growth, explore its key drivers and impact, and look at the evolving dynamics of load growth in Illinois. Attendees will gain insights into trends and challenges shaping load growth and how Illinois can prepare for the state's rapidly changing energy landscape. Next slide, Tori. As I mentioned, the IPA Power Hour webinar series is for educational purposes only. We started the Power Hour webinar series back in 2021. The series really aims to educate and inform attendees on key energy topics. And to date, we have hosted 36 webinars featuring local and national energy experts and thought leaders. If you are interested in accessing our past webinars, since 2021, please go to the IPA website under Events, and you will see the recordings of the webinar as well as the presentations. Next slide, Tori. Again, this just gives you a quick metrics on the Power Hour webinar. This is available on the presentation slide after the webinar is concluded. Next slide. This is just a quick overview of the Illinois Power Agency, especially for those who are new to our series and our agency. Illinois Power Agency is an independent state agency created in 2007 by Illinois law. We are responsible for the development of an annual electricity procurement plan for customers of electric utilities. We also support the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, public policy designed to increase the renewables in the state. And we do this through solar incentive programs, Illinois Shines and Illinois Solar for All. We also develop the long-term plan, and we also do competitive procurements for large utility scale solar, wind, and brownfield site photovoltaic projects. Next slide. Okay, now I would like to introduce our esteemed speakers for the webinar. Our first speaker for the session is Ian Goldsmith, Clean Energy Specialist at the Polsky Energy Center at World Resources Institute. Ian works to speed equitable clean energy advancement in the United States through research on issues like data center load growth, clean energy tax credits, and grid modernization, as well as provide technical assistance to entities on clean energy projects. Our next speaker is Jason Stanek, Executive Director of Government Services at PJM Interconnection. He most recently served as Chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission from 2018 to 2023. Before that, he was Senior Counsel to the Energy Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he advised on matters involving national energy policy, with specific focus on electricity issues and the operations of the regional power markets. Our next speaker is Akhilesh Ramakrishnan, Managing Energy Associate at the Brattle Group. Akhilesh specializes in planning and policy matters related to electrification, distributed energy resources, and the electric distribution system. He has consulted for a range of clients, including utilities, regulators, and technology companies in effort to evaluate the electric grid impacts of electrification and system modernization. Our final speaker for today is Jim Ruland, IPA Planning and Procurement Chief. At the IPA, Jim oversees the agency's solar incentive programs, competitive procurements for large utility-scale solar, wind, and brownfield site photovoltaic projects, and electricity procurement plans. Thank you to all our esteemed speakers for joining the session today. Now, I would like to welcome Ian to kick off today's presentation. Ian will provide an overview of load growth and explore the key drivers for this emerging energy issue. Ian will also discuss its impact on energy markets, the electric grid, and generation supply. Ian, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to the IPA for having me here today. Really excited to talk to you. I'm going to give an overview of the load growth era we are in right now, setting up the floor so that the real experts coming later can talk about the great stuff they've been working on. So if we just jump right into it, what is the moment that we're facing right now from a national level? I'm sure folks have heard about, load growth, energy demand rising to, at a ridiculous level. But what are we, seeing in terms of larger drivers and trends? So going to the next slide. So setting up the context, since around 2005 or so, we were in an era of relatively flat, stable electricity demand. Year-over-year energy was either grew very slowly. There were year-over-year declines in some areas. A lot of that was driven by energy efficiency improvements across multiple different sectors. But starting in 2023, you started to see utilities and load forecasters begin revising up their forecasts for electric load growth over the next 5-10 years. And that has only continued. Grid Strategies report from the end of 2024 indicated that the peak demand for the summer projections by 2029 had grown over five times and by 128 gigawatts. And electricity demand estimates have only increased since then, since the end of 2024. So we're in an era where folks are expecting a large amount of new energy demand to come online and come online rather quickly over the next, 3, 5, 10 years. What's driving this? If we go to the next slide, I'm sure folks, may have an idea about, one of the big drivers, and we'll be talking about that. But what we've been seeing since, the end of 2022 and onward is that multiple things seem to be coalescing at one time to be driving load growth across different areas of the U.S. We have new manufacturing of things like batteries, EVs, other advanced technologies. That's been particularly a driver in places like the Southeast, in the upper Midwest, parts of the West. We've seen building and transit electrification become even more of a driver in places with strong policy support, like California, like the Northeast. Population growth, trends that have been existing for a bit, but are only continuing or accelerating in places in the Sun Belt, places like Florida, the Carolinas, Texas. And then the big one, which I'm sure folks have been thinking about, are data centers, which are seemingly appearing everywhere across the US, and many different places are seeing load growth projections driven very high by new data center demand. But there's been particular concentrations in places like Virginia, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, and other existing and secondary data center markets. I do want to highlight, though, that we've been, folks are talking about load growth, as a nationwide phenomenon, but we've been seeing a lot of regionalization in this, where different regions across the country actually are experiencing different factors contributing to rising load. You can see this map here put together by NERC at the end of 2024. But to kind of illustrate this, if we go to the next slide, uh, highlighting, given, this is for the Illinois Power Agency, MISO released a load forecast at the end of 2024 for the next 20 years. And I think this does a really great point of illustrating that there are these regional differences, even within individual, ISOs or reliability regions. If we look here, MISO, is predicting that in North Dakota and Minnesota, that load will be driven by data centers, but also by electrification and space heating and EVs, particularly due to incentives from Minnesota for EVs. In Indiana, data centers are being driven by state incentives, as well as there's manufacturing that's pushing load growth higher. And if you look down in Louisiana and East Texas, it's really seemingly electrification and in oil and gas production, green hydrogen, as well as, like with other things, data centers that are really driving this growth. And you may notice, we're in this map, Texas is not highlighted as an area of data center growth, and also that Illinois seems to be low in terms of predictions. And you would be right, and that highlights the regionalization here in Texas. This forecast is from MISO, but a lot of the data center growth in Texas is concentrated in Dallas, in the Austin-San Antonio corridor, in other places outside of the purview of MISO. Similarly, in Illinois, a lot of the data center growth is concentrated in the Chicagoland area, and we'll be hearing more about data centers in Illinois, and particularly in the PJM area, which is not covered here. So what this illustrates is that load growth appears to be happening in a lot of different places, but it's for many different reasons, and those reasons can vary quite significantly between different states, different regions, even between parts of different states. Now, would be remiss not to mention and pay special attention to one of the biggest factors. If we go to the next slide, data centers. I'm sure folks, have heard about, new data centers coming in, all this new energy that we're going to need to, power data centers. And they are a particularly large contributor to the current load growth moment. As of February, the Rystad Energy put out a report saying that over 100 gigawatts of data center development has been announced in the U.S., and that estimate is almost 6 months old at this point. And I would not be surprised if that has increased since earlier this year. And we're seeing an expansion, not just in, I was mentioning, traditional markets like Northern Virginia, like Dallas, like the Chicago area, like Northern California, but we're also seeing expansion and growth in more secondary and tertiary markets, places that may have seen some data center development before, but haven't seen the type of concentration that like Northern Virginia has received. And additionally, there's more data centers are pushing into more rural areas, particularly ones for AI applications like your ChatGPTs or your DALL-Es or Veo3, that need a lot of computing power and therefore need a lot of power, electric power and water and land to work. So, there are proposals in places like Northern Nevada, in Kansas, in other very rural areas that haven't necessarily seen a lot of this development before, or as much of it. And so what that means is that data centers are starting to contribute to this load growth phenomenon everywhere, not just in traditional data center hubs. And then finally, taking a kind of step back from all of this, if you go to the next slide, load growth, in the context of the wider electricity future is contributing a lot of uncertainty. We've seen a lot of volatility in policy changes, in conflict around the world, in tariffs, in market cycles, over the past, half a year. And this load growth phenomenon, in particular, the data center component, which is creating a lot of variability and uncertainty, it's contributing overall to a future that is hard to predict. And the folks doing, working in this field are really doing a really amazing job trying to keep up with this variability, but it's hard to know where we're going to be in 5 years, with everything that has been changing. So I've talked about this phenomenon, and what the drivers are behind this, but what are some of the impacts that we're starting to see? If we go to the next slide, I want to talk briefly about some of the larger impacts. The first one, and I think the one that's on a lot of people's mind, is cost. So in particular, rising energy demand could mean rising bills for a lot of people. In particular, large load customer growth from things like manufacturing or data centers has been creating a lot of concerns that the expenses for generation, as well as infrastructure for interconnection, or the things needed to make sure that that load can come online, all of those things could potentially be passed on to other ratepayers, meaning that, customer bills would go higher at a time when there's already been a lot of rate increases over the past 5 years. A recent study from the PJM Market Monitor found that forecast load growth from data centers contributed to a $9.4 billion increase in capacity market revenue in 2024, which will be going on to ratepayers. And so there is a real concern about increased demand pushing up these costs for folks. I think this will be talked about later, but there are efforts across the U.S. To structure rate contracts to avoid this, to make sure that any costs that large load customers are incurring or are causing to incur, that they're the ones paying for it and it's not being put onto other ratepayers. But this is a real concern that we're seeing across both regulated utilities as well as places with power markets, just driving the average cost of power up because of more demand. Going to the next slide, there's also, concerns about having enough generation. And we're seeing that utilities and companies are identifying a need for all the generation they can get in order to keep up with all of this new load growth, particularly from data centers. Speed to market is becoming a critical factor. That's provided a boost to solar and storage technologies, which right now have some of the lowest timelines for getting online. And also there's been interest in newer clean firm technologies, things like small modular nuclear, enhanced geothermal, long duration storage. In particular, a lot of the hyperscale data center companies like your Googles, your Amazons, your Metas have announced deals with geothermal plants, investments in nuclear energy, not necessarily coming online in the next 2 years, but in the future to support overall demand. In addition to interest in renewable and clean firm power, if we go to the next slide, we're also seeing, more interest in fossil fuels. A report from January 2025 found that Southeastern utilities were planning to build over 20 gigawatts of new natural gas capacity by 2040 because of data center manufacturing load. And, the current Trump administration has explicitly supported things like, investing in new coal resources, delaying coal plant retirements, delaying natural gas plant retirements in order to meet demand from new AI data centers, new load. There is a lot of interest in using fossil fuels and using these technologies to meet the demand, particularly since there's worries about flexibility. Finally, if we go to the next slide, want to highlight that there is some concerns about reliability. The U.S. power grid has already experienced significant constraints in recent years. We've been seeing more severe weather, and data centers in particular, which are driving a lot of new load growth, present challenges. We've already seen some concerns over loss of load events in places like Virginia and Texas with a high concentration. And so, as these facilities and as more load comes online, there's potential impact to reliable service, both for the new customers as well as existing customers. So hope that is a good, that gives everybody a good background, for the other speakers. And thank you all for having me. And yeah, I hope this was helpful.
Thank you, Ian. Really appreciate it. I would now like to invite Jason to discuss RTO's role in addressing load growth, and he will be covering the key drivers behind current and forecasted load growth in PJM territories and explain how PJM has historically forecasted these trends. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Megha. And thank you, Ian. He did a great job laying the foundation for a lot of these issues that we're dealing with right now. So as we pull up the presentation here on the first slide here, you'll see who is PJM. PJM is the largest power grid operator in North America. We have the privilege of serving a part of Illinois, the Chicago ComEd region. So Chicago is the largest state, largest city in the largest power grid in the United States here. You can see that we have 88,000 miles of transmission line. We serve 67 million customers, including those in Illinois, 12 other states, plus Washington, D.C. If we go to the next slide, you heard Ian a minute ago just saying we're seeing a ridiculous level of demand, not only in PJM, but across the nation. So it's incumbent upon the grid operator, because we are a planner after all, to do our best in terms of planning for the needs of the system, both today and 20 years into the future. And that 20-year requirement is dictated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So we spend 6 months out of every year trying to figure out what the load forecast is for the next year. We typically work from July through December, and then we issue a new load forecast in January. The load forecasts consider dozens of variables, everything from the weather patterns for the past 20 years, to unemployment rates. Of course, we work very closely with our utilities on the ground across the various states, because they are in the best position to determine where their customers are building. They would know where a data center is being developed long before PJM would. So we take all this information from the utilities, from private consultants. We take a look at electric vehicle adoption rates, every possible driver that you could imagine we consider. And then by the end of the year, we come up with a determination that allows us to plot a trend line for the next 15 to 20 years. On this next slide, which is from 2024, you'll see what Ian addressed a moment ago, that we saw relatively flat load growth for many, many years. And every year we create a new line. This was the line we created in 2024. And if you take a look at the horizontal axis, you'll see the base there in the corner is 145 gigawatts, goes up to 195 gigawatts. Very little increase throughout COVID, 2021, 2022, 2023, and then that substantial jump in data centers in 2024. Now let's take a look at the 2025 slide if we advance one. Boom, it increased almost the same amount between 23 and 24 as 24 and 25. And you can see the horizontal axis. We just went from 195 gigawatts to 225. This is largely, but not exclusively, data centers. Some electrification, heat pumps, as we saw in Ian's map, transportation, electrification adoption, but largely, overwhelmingly, it's coming from data centers. And whether you call it ridiculous or astronomical, this is load growth that we've not seen ever before in PJM's 98-year history. Next slide just shows you some of the headlines that you've probably seen. The funny thing is, you look back at energy and utility conferences 24 months ago, and nobody was talking about data centers. We weren't at PJM, and if you bought stock in NVIDIA, which nobody heard of 24 months ago, you would be a very rich person at this point in time. So it just goes to show you that this hit the industry, both the United States and internationally, without much notice. And now we're working hard to address this challenge on how we match supply and demand next year by 2030 and in the future. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at Illinois in particular. And again, PJM serves the ComEd territory. Our colleagues at MISO serve the rest of the state. What we have on the left in the green and yellow are summer peaks for both 2025 and what we estimate in 2035, and identical columns for the winter peaks, both today and 10 years into the future. You'll see the annualized growth rates at the bottom, 1.6 and 2.9. These are annualized, so this is really substantial material increases in growth. We know that there's an attraction towards the suburbs of Chicago for a number of data center developers. That's definitely contributing to this. And if you've been paying attention to the heat wave and the sort of the cold snap that we had earlier this year, in January of this year, we hit our all-time record PJM high winter peak. And then a few weeks ago during the heat wave, that Monday and Tuesday, the last week of June, we hit our third and fourth highest summer peaks. So these may not be anomalies. They may be here to stay. So that just gives you an indication of growth rates in your state. Next slide just shows you that this is not a Illinois, PJM, or United States problem. The IEA, which is based in Paris, has determined that this is more of a global issue. We're seeing growth rates in the mid to high single digits across the globe, including Europe and some of the subcontinent countries as well. There's still over, I forgot how many millions of people in the continent in India that still are without electricity. They want it. It's going to be a demand for power generation across all 7 continents. Next slide shows you just where the rubber hits the road. Supply and demand have to meet somewhere along the X and Y axis on the respective curves. And it's going to have a material impact in terms of prices. You may have heard that PJM ran a capacity market last summer where the prices went up by a factor of 9. They went from, as you could see, sort of below $50 to about $270. And that just shows you that there is a supply-demand imbalance. If there is less supply and demand is increasing, the price is going to increase as well. And for those of you who are aware, PJM has just opened up its next auction for the 26-27 delivery year. We opened that up Wednesday afternoon. It'll run for until end of next week, July 16th, and then we'll issue the results later on this month. The results could range anywhere from $175 to $325. The next slide shows you that PJM is not just sitting idly by. We're doing our best to ensure that we have enough supply to meet demand, which would also have a downward pressure on prices. We issued something called the Reliability Resource Initiative this spring. It was an exigent solution that FERC approved to get 51 new projects advanced through our queue in a timely manner to allow these projects to connect to the grid by 2030. You'll see that Illinois there had 4 projects totaling about 400 megawatts in nameplate capacity. We will take our watts from wherever we could get them. We are fuel agnostic, so solar, wind, oil, gas, or coal. We do not discriminate. Our main priority is reliability. Of course, we care about decarbonization and affordability, but our number one top priority is keeping the lights on. And finally, this last slide here is what is you as policymakers, what is you as interested stakeholders can do. We're asking our states to avoid policies that prematurely push off generation before we have replacement generation. We're asking our states to look at siting and permitting challenges to get these generation projects into the queue quicker so we can match supply and demand and meet that load growth. And finally, we're asking all of our states to help us bring new resources onto the system ASAP. Thanks again for your engagement, interest in this today, and I'll turn it back to Megha.
Thank you, Jason. I would like to now welcome Akhilesh, who will discuss the challenges and opportunities utilities face in managing load growth. And he will be highlighting grid modernization efforts, distribution system upgrades, and data-driven strategies to address this evolving demand. Akhilesh, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Megha. And great job, Ian and Jason, kind of laying out the high level kind of big picture around load growth, and Jason for talking about kind of what's happening in the transmission planning, generation planning, and kind of bulk system perspective to address this growth. What I'm going to be focusing on is kind of the next step of the electricity system, which is how that energy gets down from the bulk system down to the customers, homes, and businesses. Which is in Illinois what utilities are mainly tasked with, and kind of what utilities can do in that playing field to also kind of help manage the quickly growing load growth. So next slide. Yeah, so from the kind of utility and distribution planning perspective, I'm going to be focusing on kind of three strategies that utilities can and are pursuing to help meet the quickly accelerating load growth from different drivers like electrification, transportation electrification in particular, and data centers. So the first one, and a big one, is kind of rethinking, refining, and really overhauling the distribution system planning process, which for a long time kind of worked in a pretty kind of build it when they come kind of format, where for this part of the system, a new customer would show up, they would submit a load application to the utility saying they want to get connected in this location. And then the utility would say, okay, we have capacity and we're going to connect you, or we need to build something and we'll have it ready by the time you need to connect. That paradigm is kind of becoming insufficient at this point because of a few new kinds of loads, where, for example, a big public charging station with DC fast charging that could be a megawatt total of different chargers in one site could pop up and be constructed in under 6 months. That may necessitate a substation upgrade or a feeder upgrade to serve that location. And utilities generally have lead times of 3 to 5 years for a feeder, or 5 to 10 years to build or upgrade a new substation. And so there's this kind of growing disconnect between how quickly loads can show up and how quickly utilities can build out the system to connect those loads. Data centers are another big kind of load that can be built with a lower lead time than utilities need to expand capacity. And a data center could be as large as needing a substation for itself. So all of that kind of comes back to just rethinking how utilities plan the system from the bottom up. And where that starts is from improving utility load forecasting processes, which at the distribution level are a little bit different than how it works kind of at the RTO level, where For a long time, as I mentioned, the load forecast would just include like actual applications from customers who are already applying. But that kind of needs to go beyond that at this point to have more granular kind of locational forecasting of customers who are not really real yet. And that takes us to the next step where you have to think about building in the risk assessment through scenario planning to figure out kind of which forecasted loads are high confidence, which are low confidence, what should we actually build out to. And then there's a few other aspects of distribution system planning, like kind of what you build out for. The distribution system supports load growth, but also supports other things like customer distributed energy resources, having enough capacity for those to feed back into the grid, and also using those as grid resources. So those are kind of some of the new challenges in distribution system planning, and we'll dive a bit deeper on some of those. So next slide. Yeah, so this, as kind of Ian laid out, is not an Illinois-only problem. It's kind of focused in a few different regions, and quite a few states are beginning to address this by reevaluating their planning processes. So some of the ones that are furthest along are Massachusetts, New York, and California, where in Massachusetts and New York, they recently approved kind of millions of dollars of investments in this new paradigm where those are distribution system investments that are being built in specific kind of locational hotspots for load growth before specific customers have actually shown up. So I'd say that's kind of at the frontier of this kind of distribution system planning, and we'll see how it goes. But there's kind of some of the risks that Ian laid out around, what if the load doesn't show up? Then who pays for those assets? Are they going to be allocated to the rest of the customer base and increase bills? Those are kind of some of the challenges here. This is being looked at in Illinois as well through ComEd and Ameren's multi-year integrated grid plans, where they've kind of started looking at exactly what happens in each part of the distribution system planning process, kind of looking at what benefits and costs are considered, how are DERs considered, and potential changes that need to happen to each step. Next slide. Yeah, so diving a bit deeper on each of those, load forecasting is a big one that has to get more granular, as I was saying, and also developing multiple scenarios. So it's not like kind of the whole plan is built to one pathway that has to happen. And then when you have multiple forecasts, you need a scenario planning approach to kind of evaluate, what sort of upgrades are common across different forecasts, what are the trade-offs and risks if one scenario actually occurs versus another one. And then there's the cost recovery and cost allocation aspects of this, where a new customer who wants to apply may have put in, say, 5 applications. You don't want to build out capacity in 5 locations for that one customer who's actually going to only show up in one place. So kind of figuring out the rate design and rate structure for all of this to make sure that those new customers are getting allocated the right costs and the costs are being recovered from them. And also kind of from the utilities perspective, making sure that there's kind of fairness around putting enough of the risk on the utility to make sure their processes are working well, and it's not kind of too much excess capacity being built to serve potential load growth that may not show up. Next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of diving a bit deeper into one type of scenario planning that we are working with, Brattle is working with in California with one of the utilities there. And they're really looking at this in kind of a structured, transparent approach where there's a kind of a stakeholder-led effort to develop multiple scenarios and forecasts as the first step. The utility would kind of generate multiple distribution system build-out plans to serve each forecast. There would be kind of transparent metrics to evaluate each plan. And then those metrics are used to select the best plan with commission input, kind of based on what the trade-offs are for connecting new loads on time versus potential risks for ratepayers. So that's kind of one example of how these issues are being approached in distribution system planning. Next slide. The second set of strategies is to deploy and utilize more customer-owned resources and distributed energy resources. Next slide. And that's really because these resources solve a lot of the issues that these new loads create, and it's kind of a solution that ticks a lot of boxes at the same time. So if we can click through these just so the rest of the slide shows up. Yeah, so some of them are affordability, environmental impacts, fairness, reliability. We've kind of talked about these in kind of setting the stage for all of this. And DERs are one of the options that kind of provide a good solution to all of these challenges. And that's because when you think about affordability, the solutions that DERs provide, kind of using DERs to provide these grid services means customers are getting paid for providing the services rather than a generator. In a lot of cases, they're more cost effective than building out the bulk system. A lot of customer-owned resources are more environmentally friendly, don't emit anything. Fairness, as long as you kind of get the compensation structure right for DERs, that they can kind of create a more fair and affordable situation as well. And DERs can be brought online a lot quicker than the bulk system generators in a lot of cases, where a virtual power plant, say of like 500 kilowatts or 1 gigawatt, has been set up in around 6 months in some locations, whereas with the interconnection queue for large generators, there's a huge backlog of kind of resources waiting to get connected. Next slide. Yeah, we can. Yeah, so and there's generally a huge potential to deploy more virtual power plants, demand side resources, demand response. And part of the way we can look at that is to look at who the leaders are in this space. And we analyzed EIA data to look at how much of each utility's peak demand is under management in different locations. And we found that the 10th percentile, like best utility, has 12% of its peak under management. And the rest of the utilities from kind of the 10th percentile to the 100th have a lot less under management. And that kind of provides one way of looking at what the potential is if every utility in the US were to scale up to have 12% of its peak under management, that could create about 50 gigawatts of non-firm capacity that could be used at different times in different ways. Next slide. I'll try to skip through a few just because I know I'm low on time. So next slide. Yeah, so one of our recent reports looked at strategies for utilities to kind of make this demand side resource more realizable and easier for customers to participate. And so we spoke with programs that are kind of some of the most successful in this space and came up with these 30 strategies to make the programs better, scale them up really quickly. And a lot of them have to do with kind of getting the incentives for customer resources right, building programs the right way to engage and retain customers, getting the right partnerships with like EV manufacturers and things like that. So a lot of that is in this report and kind of gives a flavor of just more depth in this space. Next slide. And finally, there's kind of the foundational legwork and investments for distribution utilities to make as well, where once the DERs are deployed, they have to be utilized in a way that's as effective as possible. And there's a lot of kind of grid investments needed to orchestrate the DERs and be able to use them at the right time to kind of balance the system at the times that's needed. So some of the investments that are needed are advanced metering infrastructure, which is already rolled out in Illinois, and then what's called DERMS, or distributed energy resource management systems, which are kind of software and hardware investments that the utility makes to be able to control the DERs on a really granular locational level and be able to use them for different services and have visibility into kind of what are all the different devices that are on the customer side of the meter. So next slide. And ComEd in its recent integrated grid plan has kind of laid out some of its plans for developing these capabilities and already has some of these capabilities. And this is kind of an illustration of the distribution system serving a neighborhood and kind of how the different resources like demand response and storage and solar can be controlled through this kind of centralized DERMS platform to be able to avoid infrastructure upgrades in some cases where they might be needed. So yeah, that's kind of a picture of what has to happen on the demand side to support all of this load growth and strategies utilities can take. And I will pass it off back to Jim and Megha.
Thank you, Akhilesh. Appreciate it. I would now like to welcome our final speaker, Jim. He will share an overview of load growth trends in Illinois and discuss how they impact the IPA's work and potential future opportunities. Jim, please go ahead when you're ready.
Thanks, Megha. So up to this point, we've had amazing conversations here and kind of discussions of both from the granular level, from what Akhilesh went through, of distributed resources and how they can kind of support or have supported load growth opportunities and challenges, from Jason discussing kind of the RTO level and how both it's looking at and trying to address the load growth challenge that is kind of here now and expanding going forward, as he kind of showed in some of his slides in the region. And then even from Ian, kind of even further step back of what's happening, where's it happening, why is it happening across the country, and even you could extrapolate that further to the world in different sections. And so really what I'm going to focus on here, and I won't dig into overly great detail here with the slides, is really IPA's considerations and approaches and things that are ongoing now and will be ongoing into the coming months and I'm sure years as we both grapple with the challenge, but also the opportunity that it presents in a number of ways. So if we go into kind of the first slide here, the thing I'd like to just very briefly touch on, but not go into too much detail because of the prior presenters here have already gone into it, are those different areas, the different things that we need to kind of consider here. And what I'd like you to take away, if nothing else, is that there's a mix of old and new. Old being things that we've seen in different respects and different values or amounts, if you will, megawatts or challenges in kind of load growth, megawatt hours or kilowatt hours, depending on the granularity, versus new. And newer is kind of a, in quotes here, where it's a continuation of maybe a different challenge we may have seen in prior years. So the already existing is, do you have increased reliance on electric devices? Electrification we've talked about, and many jurisdictions, utility and otherwise, have been driving electrification, be it transportation on one end or conversion from, say, fossil sources, be it heating and cooling needs, to really the economic development pieces of them. There's been ebb and flows of different types. And then population movements. One of the things that we saw in kind of post-COVID 2020 era is some populations have moved. And so it's a population movement leading to growth in one area or another, not necessarily nationally in certain respects. As I believe it was Jason's forecast had shown, 2020, 21, 22, 23, small sort of incremental growth. But when you really look across the whole, it wasn't massive, but there may have been sort of micro or regional adjustments. And then the new, which is data centers, artificial intelligence, expansion of new industrial or manufacturing centers and complexes that have added that new bolster in certain regions, especially in PJM and MISO for our own respects here, and how that's kind of grown over time. And it really is actually that economic development piece. It's just a different type of economic development than maybe what we've seen in prior years, be it different types of manufacturing or industrialization. So as we kind of build out from that, it's okay, well, what does that really mean? And on the next slide, you'll be able to see that there's really a couple areas and it goes down in focus depending on what you're looking at. And so this briefly touches some of the areas that Jason and Ian and even Akhilesh to a point have already touched on. So I won't dig too much, but it's regional RTO wise, right? So you're looking at grid balancing and what does load growth mean to that, or resiliency and reliability and what does it mean on that context. You've heard a couple times here about cost and cost recovery. So who's paying for what and why? Where is the demand being driven from, and who's then paying for that additional need or reinforcement? And then you're going to get differences as well between regulated and deregulated markets. The PJM and the MISO markets are heavily deregulated, but as you've seen in or might see in MISO, depending on the states we're looking at, some are vertically integrated. They're not really deregulated as Illinois is. And so when you look then at the next step over to Illinois specific, it's really how are we as a state both interacting with and supporting the markets we're participating in and our own customers, our own demand needs. And so, from an energy standpoint, we've seen substantial exports from Illinois. Our power plants or generating facilities are supporting, in many ways, some of our neighbors, whether it be further out to the east in PJM and the way that our connections work there, or the north-south corridor that we see for MISO. There's a heavy reliance in certain contexts on Illinois resources that could be changed by load growth, right? So as different regions are experiencing that growth, maybe the demand grows, or maybe the resources that we have as we grow in our own load growth, be it data centers or otherwise, we're now utilizing our own resources more, so there's less to export, and it's creating different dynamics in the market. You also have just, as we'll talk about a little bit here, our clean energy targets. As load growth goes up, so too do our obligations, and those obligations being the targets and drivers that we have for the clean energy transition that we're supporting. So that's increased clean energy credit obligations. It's just cleaner energy. So meeting the need that we have, that we've set in policy and statute to really drive forward in that context. And then at the end of the day, it's stepping back and saying, well, it's also maintaining that reliability and that cost conscious nature that we need to have for our customers. So ensuring that at the end of the day, the lights turn on when you need them, that the reliability is there, whether it be a grid challenge because of, like we've had over a number of weeks now, that hotter temperature, as Jason talked about, or even in the winter when you have those cold elements, or just traditional shoulder month average everyday run of the mill days, right? That the power's there and that it's done so in a cost efficient manner. And so really, as you then tip to what we're looking at the IPA and what it means, it's where we're at here with our different energy plans. And it's also some of our concepts of resource adequacy. And so if we flip to the next slide from our own plans here, there's two that many of you will be familiar with. So I have a lot of words on a page, and you can kind of look at this, or you may have already looked at our plans that we have, but it's the electricity procurement plan and the long-term renewable procurement plan, or the long-term plan as it's typically called. So from the electricity procurement plan, it's a focus on default service. So I want to kind of pull that off to the side because it's not a look at the entire Illinois energy need. It's really for those customers, small business or residential, that choose not to shop with a Aries or alternative retail electric supplier. And that focus is on the energy need. So it's setting that default service rate, it's going out and securing power, and for the Ameren customers, it's also capacity as a capacity hedge to meet that customer need in a series of blocks. So for these smaller customers, you're not going to see the data centers actually impacting this plan, but what you will see is that electrification transition that's occurring, whether it be EVs, customers going from the traditional combustion vehicles to electric vehicles, or even plug-in hybrids. You're also going to see it when it comes to heat pumps. If you're going from, say, a gas or boiler system to a heat pump, that increase in energy need will actually increase the amount of energy that we have to secure to meet that growing demand. Or you also have the economic piece. So as new small businesses begin to spring up in different regions, we'll need to kind of cover that through the power that we're securing. And for the Ameren customers, we have this capacity hedge. And what you are seeing actually from the data center piece and other sorts of load growth is capacity costs have increased, and that's due to that data center, that demand to maintain and ensure the maintenance of reliability. And it actually does translate to customers, large and small, on the grid, in just how the framework for not just PJM, but MISO as well, how they frame what they do. So it's who's paying for those costs to ensure that reliability is maintained across the board. So we're constantly evaluating what load growth looks like, both for what we're securing for these customers that are on default service, as well as just what the market means in general because of how some of these costs ultimately translate through to customers, in this case, say capacity. But what's really interesting is that transition to a long-term plan, and that is because there's the clean energy aspect of this, right? And so we want to ensure the reliability we've talked about in the prior slide, but the long-term plan covers a multitude of different aspects, be it utility scale procurements for renewables, wind, solar, hydro, brownfield solar, and so on. You have the customer programs, Illinois Shines, or the adjustable block program, as it's known in statute. You also have Illinois Solar for All. And then you have these other considerations. There's the adjacent state procurements that can occur in conjunction with the utility scale, as well as the self-direct program. And these are all just different aspects that are trying to balance the need of the system and the targets that we have for a clean and diverse energy mix. And as you have load growth occurring, and it's growing, and as we've seen in a couple other slides by our other presenters, quickly, there's this new need to kind of catch up, that we need more clean energy more energy in general to meet this growing demand and kind of evolve to what kind of the system as a whole is evolving to. And that really is the driver. If we go to the next slide, it just kind of characterizes here a concept. So these aren't, I'll say, real numbers in the high and the low aspects. It's more of just a figurative example here. But we have the black line in the middle that really shows what the current forecast might look like. And this current forecast you could actually see in the RPS budget numbers that we put out. And what happens if you would have, in this case, I just did an arbitrary 25% load increase just to show the dynamism that occurs over time and what this means to achievement of our own clean energy goals. And then what this might mean if there's the larger aspect to Illinois. So from the clean energy target, we move up in that green line to that green dotted line. And in the short term, 2025, 26, up through, say, the 2030 period, it means a substantive number of RECs, right? It's 7 million RECs from where we're at, that increase up. And then when you get out to the later years, as the RPS percentages increase over time, it goes up to 19 to 20 million RECs just with that load increase of a flat 25% kind of every single year. It's not compounding in this case, just a flat increase to what the current forecasts are. And what that really means, and what I'd like to drive forward on this, is that aspect that we need more. And there's that new need for a diversification to try to catch up to these needs to meet the needs from a reliability and a clean energy standpoint. And it's really from that perspective that we, as little back as 2015 maybe, you'd look at load forecasts and say there's basically no increase, or it's maybe a 0.5%. Now, as you saw from, I think it was Jason or maybe Ian, we were looking at I think it was Jason, 1.9% in the summer to 2.9% or something to that effect in the winter. And it just shows how even in that point, we've seen a pretty substantive jump in this period. So kind of the interest of time, I'll move forward, but there's a number of different opportunities, I think, in the next slide here that we're looking at. So in addition to the procurements that the IPA already conducts and the plans we already are implementing for the programs, there's a number of opportunities here on the horizon that is energy storage. One of the numbers I quick jotted down is, as Jason went through, when they had the recent RRI, 2.2 gigawatts, or I think it was 2.2 gigawatts or so, was from storage alone. So you're already seeing this need, this opportunity need that the market's trying to fill with the dynamism that energy storage provides. Of course, when you're trying to build new and contract with new generating facilities of different types, be it wind, solar, storage, and so on, you need transmission. So there's this new look at transmission planning, be it at the RTO level or our own state level for the utilities within our state or those competitive developers in our state, looking at opportunities to build new transmission, be it high voltage, direct current, or the more traditional alternating current transmission. It's how do we get the power from, in some cases, the decentralized locations, wind that might be farther away from certain cities and load centers to those load centers in a kind of cost efficient and timely manner. And then even new emerging technologies. There's a number of them. You could go through and kind of talk about some of the bigger ones, modular nuclear, but there's green hydrogen, renewable natural gas. And then as we heard from Akhilesh, there's even the distributed resources, like you're seeing with the IPA's own Illinois Solar for All and Illinois Shines programs, where it's rooftop solar or it's smaller community solar projects and so on. So the last aspect, and I know we're kind of at time, so I'll fly through this quickly. And as Megha had said before, the slides will be presented later. If we kind of jump through what maybe, oh, we'll start here. So we have resource adequacy, right? And resource adequacy very, very quickly just means a look at the system and its needs in relation to the demand. So what generating assets and other assets, transmission and so on, do we need or do we have to support the demands on that system? And as we've heard in both my presentation and others before me, that needs changing. It's been changing over the past few years, and we're going to see it change quite rapidly. So there's a process that is underway right now with the IPA, the ICC, the IEPA, and we're actually working and we're outreaching to PJM, MISO, and others, the utilities and so on, to evaluate this. And so really by the end of the year, we have a resource adequacy study that the agencies in Illinois here are going to perform to evaluate that, look at what our targets are, what our policy needs are, what the evolution of the market itself is in Illinois and in surrounding states and those markets we participate in, to say, what does it mean? Do we have what we need? If we don't, how could we bridge that gap to ensure we maintain that reliability, the resource adequacy standards that we need to ensure we're getting what we need when we need it over the next 5 and more years beyond? And so as we kind of bridge all of these elements together and kind of move on to the last slide here, building on this, we've had discussions legislatively in the most recent spring session about a multitude of different opportunities to help bolster these, to help meet these needs. And while that bill didn't pass yet, I'm pretty confident that we'll have opportunities going forward with that. One of the big things I'd say is there's a couple takeaways in really shorts: flexibility, dynamism, supply diversity that we've seen and heard through, I think, all of our presentations, as well as this forecasting. So ensuring we understand what's happening and when it's happening. And there's a lot going on. And I think it's these sorts of forums and conversations that are really helping to drive forward what we need and kind of the resource mixes that we have. So I went through it quickly, but I'm happy to talk more. Megha, back to you and keep it going.
Thank you, Jim. In the interest of time, we will have to wrap here, but I really want to thank our wonderful presenters for taking the time to come and present such insightful session. This webinar also wouldn't have been possible without the support of our stakeholders and attendees who take such keen interest in joining these webinars. As I mentioned in the chat, a recording and a presentation copy of this webinar session will be available on the IPA website. We'll try to get that up by Monday latest, if not today. And I really want to thank you all for your interest and support. And on behalf of the agency, want to wish you all a great weekend. Take care.